Three Versions of Judas is a short story, indeed a very short story, authored by Jorge Luis Borges, published originally in the collection Artifices. And as you can guess, it centers on the biblical figure of Judas and how he ought to be interpreted. And the other key character in this is going to be the interpreter, the theologian Nils Runeberg, who we read about if he'd been born in a different time, he might have been a heretical character. By the time that he's carrying out his own researches, people are more or less ignoring him, rejecting his theses, and allowing him to live in a kind of obscurity. We learn that he published the first edition of Kristus och Judas in 1904. In 1909, he publishes his magnum opus, Den hemlige Frälsaren. And there's a German translation of it. And then he says, before undertaking an examination of the works mentioned above, it is important to reiterate that Nils Runeberg, a member of the National Evangelical Union, was a deeply religious man. Why does this matter? Well, he's doing theology not as just sort of as he mentions, something that could be done as kind of like a parlor game or among the intellectual set. No, he believes in this, and he wants to understand this figure of Judas. And he's going to come up, this is why it's called the Three Versions of Judas, with three different interpretations of who Judas was and what his significance was. So we find out that for Runeberg, the theses that he has were the key that unlocked one of theology's central mysteries, right? So he goes on and he says, they were the stuff of study and meditation. A lot of thought is going into this, of historical and philological controversy. At the time that Runeberg is writing, we've already had a lot of biblical criticism going on. There's an entire, we could say, learned network of people who write back and forth about these and argue about it. And then he goes on and he notes three other things. These theses were the stuff of arrogance, of exaltation, and of terror. They justified and destroyed his life. So this, shows that it's not just theology as an academic discipline that Runeberg is engaged in. This is existential for him. He wants to know what the function of Judas really was. And we're going to learn here as well that those who peruse this article, which is the Three Versions of Judas, should likewise consider it records only Runeberg's conclusions, not his dialectic or his proofs. And is that entirely true? Well, we're not getting any of the full dialectic or proofs, right? But we are getting more than just bare conclusions. And he says, it will be said the conclusion no doubt preceded its proofs, in quotes, but what man can content himself with seeking out proofs for a thing not even he himself believes in or of whose teaching he cares not for? Well, we are going to get a bit of Runeberg's arguments reconstructed here by Borges. So we have three different versions. What is the first version? It's the one that shows up in the book Kristus och Judas. And it begins with an epigraph by DeQuincy, which says, it is not one thing, but all the things which legend attributes to Judas Iscariot that are false. Now, what would legend be in this case? Does that apply to the scriptures? Well, there's all sorts of other things that are floating around that are supposed to be about Judas, but turn out to not actually be so. And we're going to get from Runeberg a transformation of this. So DeQuincy had speculated Judas had delivered up Christ in order to force him to declare his divinity and set in motion a vast uprising against Rome's yoke. So DeQuincy is adopting what has now become a kind of commonplace interpretation of what Jesus' mission was, to lead some sort of revolt against Rome. And then so Judas is this catalyzing agent. Runeberg is going to go further with this. It's not just political, it's metaphysical, as Borges is going to say. Runeberg suggests a vindication of a metaphysical nature. And here we're going to get some of the argument. He begins by emphasizing how superfluous Judas's action was in order to identify a teacher who preached every day in the synagogue and worked miracles in the plain sight of thousands of people. There's no need of betrayal by one of the teacher's own apostles. So, his action of going into the garden, leading the authorities there, kissing Jesus, not actually needed, right? That is precisely what occurred. And he goes on, to assume an error in the scriptures is intolerable, but it's no less intolerable to assume a random act intruded into the most precious event in the history of the world. Therefore, here's one of the conclusions, Judas's betrayal was not a random act, but predetermined, with its own mysterious place in the economy of redemption. Runeberg continues, the Word, when it was made flesh, passed from omnipresence into space, from eternity into history, from unlimited joy and happiness into immutability and death. To repay that sacrifice, it was needed that a man, in representation of all mankind, make a sacrifice of equal worth. Now, let's pause there for a moment, because some viewers may not know about the long, complex history of Christian speculation on the redemption. So a sacrifice is needed. The divine enters into time, space, flesh, limitedness. And the idea is that the sacrifice in the crucifixion, the suffering, and all of that somehow makes up for the sin of human beings. Now, that's the standard Orthodox take, but Runeberg is going to take this in a different direction. So again, it was needful that a man, in representation of all mankind, make a sacrifice of equal worth. Orthodox theology says, okay, that man was Christ, Jesus Christ. Runeberg is saying, no, that was Judas Iscariot. Alone among the apostles, Judas sensed Jesus' secret divinity and his terrible purpose. The Word had stooped to become mortal. Judas, a disciple of that Word, would stoop to become an informer, the most heinous crime infamy will bear, and to dwell amid inextinguishable flames. So Judas is somehow a reflection of Jesus, and thus did Nils Runeberg explain the enigma that is Judas. Judas willingly does things that will earn him eternal damnation so that Jesus' mission can go forward, so that human beings can in fact be redeemed. Now, does this meet with a very, what should we call it, happy review by potential critics? No, as a matter of fact, understandably so. Theologians of every faith brought forth refutations, and we don't have to go into all of those. So what does Runeberg do? He takes to heart those refutations, and he modifies his thesis. So now we're going to get to the second version of Judas. There's a partial rewriting of the reprehended book, modifying its doctrine. Borges says he abandoned the theological ground to his adversaries and proposed oblique arguments of a moral order. He admitted that Jesus would have no need of a man to carry out his plan for the redemption of mankind. Then he rebutted those who claimed we know nothing of the inexplicable betrayer. What do we actually know about Judas? Well, he was one of the apostles, one chosen to herald the kingdom of heaven, to heal the sick, cleanse the lepers, raise the dead, cast out demons. The acts of a man, thus singled out by the Redeemer, Runeberg goes on, merit the most sympathetic interpretation we can give him. So the question is, well, why did he do what he did? Traditionally, it's been attributed to greed, the 30 pieces of silver. And Runeberg says that doesn't make sense at all. This doesn't work. Why? That would be a base motive. Nils Runeberg proposed a motive at the opposite extreme, a hyperbolic, even limitless asceticism. The ascetic debases and mortifies the flesh. What does Judas do? He takes it to another level. Judas debased and mortified the spirit. How so? Well, he renounces honor, goodness, peace, the kingdom of heaven. And again, pause and think about traditional Christian theology. You engage in asceticism, you engage in renunciation. Why? So that you can earn the kingdom of heaven, so you can have peace, so you can have goodness, so you can go from being the lowest to the highest. Runeberg says Judas is doing the opposite of that. We read a little bit more. He plotted his sins with terrible lucidity. In other sins, there can be some sort of virtue, as he's going to say. In adultery, tenderness and abnegation often play a role. In homicide, courage. In blasphemy and profanation, a certain satanic zeal. Judas chose sins unvisited by any virtue, abuse of confidence, and betrayal. He labored with titanic humility. He believed himself unworthy of being good. Judas sought hell because joy in the Lord was enough for him. He thought that happiness, like goodness, is a divine attribute which should not be usurped by man. So, a different version of Judas being provided here in the revised version of the book. And then we move on to the third in this other book, Dem hemlige Frälsaren. He completes and revised the manuscript, and the book appears in 1909, right? The book's general argument is not complex, we read, although its conclusion is monstrous. We're going to get a very different version of Judas here. God, argues Nils Runeberg, stooped to become man for the redemption of the human race. We might well then presume that the sacrifice effected by him was perfect, not invalidated or attenuated by omissions. Okay, I think most people would go along with that. And then Runeberg introduces another important premise. To limit God's suffering to the agony of one afternoon on the cross is blasphemous. Why? Well, because the sacrifice has to be made for all time. And then, to claim that he, God, made flesh, was man and was incapable of sin is to fall into contradiction. So, most theologians are fine saying that Jesus could feel weariness, cold, distress, hunger, and thirst. Runeberg says one might also allow him to be able to sin and be condemned to damnation. The fullness of possible human experience, the fullness of possible sacrifice. And so what's going to happen here? So for Runeberg, we find out in time and eternity, the Word made flesh, God was totally made man, but man to the point of iniquity, man to the point of reprobation and the abyss. How does this happen? Not through Jesus the Christ, but through his apostle who betrays him, Judas. He says, in order to save us, he could have chosen any of the lives that weave the confused web of history. He could have been Alexander or Pythagoras or Rurik or Jesus. He chose an abject existence, Judas. Judas is the Redeemer, not Jesus. And theologians don't give this a very welcome reception. They give a sort of an ecumenical indifference. And Runeberg draws something from this. He says, God had ordered that indifference. God did not want his terrible secret spread throughout the earth. Runeberg realized his hour was not yet come, right? And so what infinite punishment would be Runeberg's for having discovered and revealed the terrible name of God as Judas. So Runeberg, before he dies of a ruptured aneurysm, wanders the streets of Malmo, crying out for a blessing that he be allowed to share the inferno with the Redeemer, who is Judas. So we've gone from a earlier version of Judas. Judas is, helping the divine mission go along. He plays a vital role. To Judas is the one who is sacrificed. To Judas is the Redeemer himself. And Runeberg wants to participate in that redemption in eternal suffering. So, very interesting theological speculations here that Borges is indulging in, using a fictional character who's writing books that, of course, nobody reads because they're not real books. They're only real books within the framework of the story, all bearing on, we could say, not just Christology, but Judasology, the sort of account of what these characters are supposed to be doing within the economy of redemption that God provides to human beings here on earth.